So now we are moving to our social justice and Muslim section. And first we have Ms. Alizah Iqbal Ali. She's a third-year medical student at Morehouse School of Medicine. She's interested in psychiatry and manifestations of psychosomatic diseases. Her interests in research include omics, social justice, psychology, and disease process. So please give a big round of applause to Ms. Alizah Iqbal Ali.
And click, okay. Okay.
Assalamualaikum. My name is Alizah Ali. I'm going to be talking about systemic racism and how the knowledge of systemic racism and the lived discrimination affects how our racial identity impacts how we view the police, especially in the Muslim population. My team consisted of myself, Mina Dalami, Sadia Alahi, Dr. Rani Awad, and Dr. Marji. I couldn't have done this without my lab, the Muslim Mental Health and Islamic Psychology lab. Our team has no conflicts of interest to disclose. So if you're comfortable, before we begin, I want you to, with a raise of hands, show if you've ever experienced any sort of lived discrimination or any sort of systemic racism. And this can be anything from being stopped by the TSA, getting your bags checked, feeling like you got passed over by a job, feeling like you got unfairly not promoted. I know I have. So this is something that's called systemic racism or part of systemic racism. And one way that we see it is through systemic racism by the police. And we see this a lot in the Black communities. And a lot of racial minorities are affected by this. We saw this in the New York PD's stop and frisk policies. In the Floyd et al. Versus City of New York case, there was a lot of racial profiling done by the New York PD. And they filed a case against the New York PD that disproportionately affected Black and Latina individuals. So Black and Latina individuals in New York only make up around 50% of the population. Only make up around 50% of the population, versus they made up around 80% of all of stop and frisk, or all of New York stops. So, and they were stopped in their own neighborhoods. They were stopped by doing regular things, just like going to the grocery stores, or just walking down their own neighborhoods. And why are we looking at a Muslim population? When we experience our lives, when we go out into the world, we don't go out into the world as just a race. We go out into the world as, I don't go out into the world as just a South Asian. I go out into the world as a South Asian female. I go out into the world as a South Asian Muslim female. I don't get to experience just discrimination in terms of being South Asian at one single time. I get to experience being discriminated as a Muslim. I get to be discriminated as a female at the same time. And Muslims have been discriminated a lot ever since 9/11. In the Islam versus City of New York case, they filed a case against the increased surveillancing of Muslims in New York. They found that there was increased surveillancing of Muslims in elementary schools and mosques and MSAs and retail stores. And they did this through different racial groups. In the Turkmen versus Ashraf case, this was filed by different Muslim, South Asian, and Arab men who were detained by the CIA and the FBI after the increased policing after 9/11. And they were detained in different maximum detention centers, as well as a solitary confinement. And once they were released, they tried to file this case, which was dismissed by the Supreme Court, and they filed an appeal last month. Sorry. So why are we looking at this now? So in the spring of 2020, there was a series of murders done by law enforcement. There was a murder of Ahmaud Arbery, and in February 2020, there was a murder of Breonna Taylor in March, and there was a murder of George Floyd in late May. After the murder of, and one thing that linked all of these murders together was they had a significant involvement with law enforcement. 2 of them were done by law enforcement, and 1 had a significant amount of cover-up done by law enforcement. And after the murder of George Floyd, there was a series of protests and peaceful demonstrations throughout the world and throughout the country. It was increasingly done, as you can see on the map, it was increasingly done in the US and in Europe. And Joaquin disseminated the survey during the times of these protests. And we wanted to study during this time to understand how racial identity impacts, or how we view our race impacts the way that we view the police, and how we understand Black history and how we understand systemic racism impacts that relationship. So what did we do? So the Joaquin Institute for Islamic Research made this study called the Racial and Muslim Identity Survey. And they disseminated during the time of the protests that I previously mentioned, through email listservs, through partnering with different Black communities in major cities such as Philadelphia, New York, Chicago, Detroit. And they collected responses from many different individuals. 30% were Black, 40% were South Asian, 10% were, around 10% were white, 17% were Arab. We looked at particularly the racial identity variables. So we wanted to understand, how do you view race in terms of yourself? How do you understand race in terms of your own self-concept? And that's what we call racial centrality. We wanted to understand how you feel like you belong with your race. How do you view others of your own race? And that's racial private regard. How do you feel like other people think of your race? How do you feel like the external public view is of your race? And that's racial public regard. We wanted to look at how they viewed the police. So do they view the police positively? Do they view the police negatively? Do they approve of what the police are doing in their neighborhoods? Do they approve of the amount of surveillance being done in their neighborhoods? We wanted to see how much they knew about Black history. We wanted to see how much they understood about systemic racism. So did they know who Malcolm X was? Did they know who Martin Luther King was? Do they know what redlining is? Do they know what Jim Crow laws were? We wanted to see how much lived discrimination they had. So we did this through measuring how many times they were stopped by the police in their entire lifetime. And we did all of these analyses through the programming software. And we did a multiple mediation analyses to understand how both the knowledge of systemic racism and Black history and police stops affected this relationship. So these are our results. So to summarize that really complicated figure, so when we looked at the results, we saw that police stops and knowledge impacted the relationship between racial centrality and police perspective in terms of a suppressive mediation. So what this means is that if I had the same amount of racial centrality as the next person, if I had the same amount of self-concept as the next person, if I was stopped by the police more, irrespective of what race I was, I would view the police more negatively. And in terms of racial private regard, it was similar. It was, if I was stopped by the police more, even though I had the same amount of racial private regard as the next person, I would view the police similarly. With partial suppressive mediators, it means that there's something else that might be going on. For police stops and knowledge in terms of the racial public regard and police perspectives relationship, it acted as a positive mediator. So if I was stopped by the police more, I may have viewed the police more positively, even though I had the same amount of racial public regard. So how do we apply this to current day? So a lot of the Black history and knowledge of systemic racism that we looked at was not historical knowledge. It was knowledge that pertained to prior to the millennium. And a lot of the current day knowledge that we have is from social media, is from news outlets. And we saw that a lot of studies through our literature review noticed similar results with social media usage, and especially social media usage in terms of viewing what police brutality was, what certain impacts were about police brutality. And if you think about where you were during COVID-19, especially during March, April, May, and June 2020, you were stuck at home, you were stuck on your phone, you were on social media constantly, and you were constantly getting inundated by all of this news that was going on. So you had an increased awareness of everything that was going on in the world. And we saw this through how Black Lives Matter, how George Floyd, how Breonna Taylor were trending Twitter tags. We saw this with the graph that I have on the screen is the Google Trends analysis about how there was an increased amount of searches for what Black Lives Matter was, who George Floyd was, and who Breonna Taylor was. How do we understand what police stops were? So police stops are inherently a traumatic effect, but what can impact how you view these traumatic events? So if you have an increased amount of racial identity, if you have an increased amount of racial centrality, especially, it can impact the way that you understand all of these events. You might see these events as more racially charged. You might see these events as more detrimental to the way that you could view the police. And we see this in particular in the way that individuals who were stopped by the police more throughout their lifetime raise their children. If you've ever seen movies or if you've ever talked to individuals who have, especially in the Black community, where they've talked about how they've been raised to be aware of how to talk to the police when they get stopped, how they've been taught to deal with law enforcement from the age of as young as 5 or 6. So I want to talk about some of the limitations and some of the future directions. So we had a limited number of the non-Muslim population. So we were only able to conduct a study in the Muslim population that we surveyed, or that Yateen surveyed. And we wanted to do an intersectional study. However, because we couldn't analyze we couldn't analyze the difference between the responses between the non-Muslim population and the Muslim population, we couldn't understand whether or not racial identity had anything to impact with on this relationship, but we could see how racial identity did. Another thing that we can branch out with is to include mental health variables. So as I mentioned, getting stopped by the police is inherently a traumatic event. And to increase how understanding how mental health variables, how increase anxiety after these events, increase anxiety with having a decreased amount of police perceptions or decreased police perspectives can impact your mental health. We know that racism and discrimination are social determinants of health. So they impact the way that we view, they impact our physical health, they impact our mental health, they impact how we have, like, they can increase the amount of cardiovascular disease, they can increase the amount of blood pressure, they can increase the risk of anxiety, depression. And they do this through increased psychological distress. So we could also understand how this relationship ties into the social determinants of health. Another limitation that we had was that there was a possible increased social awareness during this time. So people were, as I mentioned, people were looking at social media more, people were inundated by the news of all of the police brutality that was going on. And that means that people probably, different individuals are probably looking at what systemic racism was. People probably understood more about what Black history was during this time. And this could probably inflate our results. Also to understand that as I mentioned, the impact of our mediating variables, police stops and knowledge were partial mediating variables. And to understand what other impacts could affect that relationship. Could it be psychological stress? Could it be coping factors? These are my references. So I want to thank you for coming and listening. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to our lab or to Maristan. Thank you.
Give another round of applause for Ms. Miller, please.
Thank you so much, Ms. Alizah Ali. And now we have another presentation. The presenter is Mr. Waleed Sami. He's a third-year doctoral student at Virginia Commonwealth University's Counselor Education Program. He's also developing novel interventions through Rouge and Tumble play theory to help manage aggression in adolescents and children. So please give a big applause to Mr. Waleed Sami. So try to be in the range of the camera and try to keep the mic as close.
Okay.
So
Is this your slide correction? Yes. Okay, I'll make it a slideshow. Very good. Okay.
Assalamu alaikum, can everyone hear me? Nice to see you all. My name is Waleed Sami, and like the biography introduced me as, I'm a third-year doctoral student in counseling education at Virginia Commonwealth University in Richmond, Virginia. So glad to be with you all today. I hope this is an instructive and interesting sort of discussion and taking maybe a different approach to how we conceptualize social justice, the many avenues to be oriented towards social justice as people interested in mental health. As Muslims, it's a huge part of our deen. So I'm very interested in trying to also bring another perspective and how we can aid and increase our social justice perspectives. And that's through looking at issues of poverty and inequality and income inequality. So we're gonna do some basic definitions of those terms. We're gonna see how they impact mental health. We're gonna end with some action steps about what we can do to improve and maybe conceptualize and have a positive intervention with, like I mentioned, poverty and income inequality. So yeah, we're gonna go over that really quickly. Right. Okay, perfect. Like my biography mentioned, I have several research interests. The main ones are looking at income inequality and political economy as systemic distributors of how poverty and income inequality impact mental health, which is what we're going to go over today. I also look at rough and tumble play, its influence on aggression. And of course, I'm interested in everything to do with Muslim Americans and mental health. So hopefully we'll tie some of these larger concepts in, and then we'll end with how issues of poverty and inequality impact our community. Okay, so some of the problem, income inequality is incredibly high within the United States. We have some of the most unequal, amongst all advanced developed nations. We have some of the highest inequality in the OECD amongst industrialized nations. We're gonna go over what income inequality is and how that's distinguished from poverty really quickly. But as you all know, we have incredibly high amounts of inequality in this nation, right? Inequality, it further affects folks from marginalized backgrounds who are likely to be concentrated at the distribution at the bottom of our society. So one way to sort of back up and understand this is to realize that the way financial resources and social determinants of mental health are distributed across society are unequal, right? And when we look at what are social determinants of mental health, we're looking at things like housing. We're looking at things like access to transportation. We're looking at things like access to healthcare. What is your job? Is your job stable? Does it provide you some dignity? Does it allow you to meet your working conditions? All these are contributors to how we understand mental health, right? So that is a distribution. So if we were to put it all onto a pie, we'd see that a few people have a lot of those necessary requirements. Most people have, between enough to kind of get by, sort of paycheck to paycheck, or what we would call middle class. And then there's a whole host of folks within America who don't have access to them. As people who are clinicians and working in a variety of different settings will know that mental health challenges, diagnoses, especially severe ones, chronic mental health and health conditions are exacerbated at the bottom of this income distribution. So what I want you all to kind of walk away from here knowing is that there's a pie, if you conceptualize a pie in our brain, and there's a spectrum, and on that spectrum, you're gonna see a lot of health and mental health chronic issues at the bottom of the income spectrum. That's kind of what we mean by inequality. There's an unequal distribution of what makes you mentally well, or what's causal to making you mentally well, like access to transportation, safe schools, safe neighborhoods, pollution, et cetera, et cetera. Most of that is not accessible to people at the bottom of the income distribution. This is why income inequality and its sister, poverty, are really important places to start as a community, to understand what's going on in our community, but also to understand what we have to do to advocate for social justice and sort of conceptualize our work. So that's sort of what we're doing. As I mentioned here, individuals and families that live in poverty have a higher likelihood of experiencing all sorts of mental health challenges. And there's growing evidence, and that's pretty well established, right, within the health and mental health literature. We know poverty is hugely causal and hugely associated with a lot of mental health challenges. And there's growing evidence that income inequality is just the same predictor of poor mental health outcomes. So this is kind of the problem statement and what we're grappling with. So poverty and income inequality, right? When we say like someone is poor, this is a poor area, this is an unequal area. I know at Yale, we can go to the other side of town in Hartford and we see a very different distribution of what we would call social determinants of health and social determinants of mental health. These are reflections of what we call distributional challenges within the political economy. And the purpose of utilizing political economy to understand mental health is to sort of see it as a structure, right? It's a theoretical tool that allows us to see how this structure kind of can affect downstream impacts to our mental health. And what I mean by that is there's a pie, right? I told you to conceptualize a pie, how resources are distributed. Who gets what in society, right? How are the wealthy able to maintain their wealth? How are people able to obtain social mobility? All these attended questions that we have that so impact our mental health and health are often reflections of what we would call conflicts within the political economy, which is really a study of how institutions in our society have conflicts over how resources are distributed. And how those conflicts emerge, then distribute from there, going down, different variety of social determinants of mental health. And from there, then we see impacts on individuals and families. A great example of this, right? Who here knows that, the impact, you can just raise your hand. Who here knows the impact of housing on mental health? Very high, okay? If you have a house, if you have a safe shelter over your head, your mental health outcomes go through the roof, right? We have a fighting chance. If you take away someone's shelter, you can predict the health and mental health is just gonna tank 9 times out of 10. That's how important housing is as a basic right and as a basic contributor. So a lot of movements within the country are designed to try to give people housing. But here's the problem. When you try to build high density housing in certain neighborhoods, folks with single family homes will often see their property values decrease. This is a conflict. So folks often in single family homes don't want higher density housing units because they see their wealth potentially decrease. So folks who need more affordable, higher density housing don't often have access to it. What's going on here? There's a conflict. There's a conflict in the neighborhood. No matter what signs people are putting up saying, oh, people are welcome here, blah, 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 right? We see those signs, but we see the actions behind it are actually reflections of distributional problems. Because if folks come here in a high density area, the wealth distributed to our homes is going to go down. You have to kick them out. Right? So it's called NIMBYism, not in my backyard. There's a whole lot of literature on this and other examples too. So housing is a great way to understand conflicts within the political economy and how they impact things downstream. And one of the fights is often between, labor rights and employment rights and folks who own businesses. Looking at, the ISPU, which is a great data place. Some of you may be familiar with it within the Muslim American community. Great data, that's going on here, led by Dalia Mujahid and other people. And they fortunately have done some good research on our community. So very quickly, we know that 1 out of 3 Muslims live close to or at poverty, right? More than 1/4 of American Muslims suffered job losses during the pandemic, and that was more than the general public. So we see in our community, despite some wealth being here, we see a high level of inequality, right? So there are folks who are very successful, mashallah, they have good businesses, they have good professional job titles, but we have sort of an undercurrent of deep poverty and inequality within our community. So our community is actually very unequal. If 1 out of 3 of us are close to poverty, that's a huge distributional gap. Muslims are more likely, this is coming from the Pew Research Center, Muslims are more likely than the general public to be unemployed. The rate of home ownership during the Great Recession, 2008, the loss of homes and stable housing and wealth amongst the Muslim community was very high. So we need to understand that our community has a lot of inequality in it, has a lot of poverty in it, more than I think most folks are willing to understand. So then we know, kind of putting things together, there are a lot of attendant health and mental health concerns going on in our community that are directly correlated with the large inequality in our community. So what's the impact? We know that it impacts mental health, but here's some specific cases. One of my favorite studies, and it's a very dire study, but it's one of my favorite studies to sort of bring up to demonstrate what's going on here. One of my favorite studies was the Case and Beaton study that came out in 2017, and they discussed deaths of despair. And they noted that Americans without college degrees were dying through what we would call deaths of despair, suicide and addiction, alcohol abuse, right? Called deaths of despair because of loss of meaning and loss of structure and stability in their lives. And it was so high that the overall mortality rate of America was dropping, which is unheard of in developed nations. Developed nations' mortality rate is growing because people are living longer due to better income and better access to healthcare. America is an outlier in that folks without college degrees are actually going backwards. Their lifespans are shortening due to deaths of despair. And these deaths of despair are tied to loss of steady employment within their states, right? This is deindustrialization. You know, one of the reflections of the distribution of where, you know, people are in terms of their health and mental health is called the social gradient. That's how the World Health Organization sort of conceptualizes it. And social gradient is that spectrum where if you're on the top, you have more access to resources, education, social capital, wealth, you're gonna be healthier and mentally more well. If you're at the bottom of the social gradient, you're not gonna have access to all that, more than likely. Here is the subjective social status ladder. This is an excellent ladder to use clinically, whether you're a doctor, a clinician, social worker, health educator. It turns out that this subjective social status ladder we can give to folks, and it turns out that they can place themselves on this ladder, and it is more predictive than looking at your socioeconomic status or how your health and mental health is, right? So this is the social gradient. You know how I mentioned there's a spectrum up and down, right? I can give this to all of you anonymously. You can place yourselves wherever you place yourself on this ladder, let's say at 4 or 7 or 8. And from there, I have a really good shot of understanding your health and mental health. That's how powerful this tool is. And it's called subjective social status because it turns out that folks at the bottom of the social gradient know that they're at the bottom of the social status. They have a lot of health and mental health referent challenges associated with that. Thank you. As a result, we found that every unit of decrease in perceived social rank, you have an increase in deaths of despair. So your perception of your social rank is very predictive of whether you're going to fall into things like alcohol abuse or addiction. And as a mental health clinician, where I practiced for many years, this is exactly what I work with. I work with what we would call deaths of despair, especially if you're in community mental health. You're working constantly with addiction. You're working with familial dysfunction. You're working with alcohol abuse and addiction. 9 out of 10, most of my cases are with that, right? And a lot of that can be associated with relative income relationships. And they're better at predicting suicide outcomes than absolute income understanding. So if I was just to look at the salary you make, right, that's a predictor. But if I was to look at how you relatively think your salary is compared to others, that's even more of a powerful predictor. So there are psychological and social status and classism impacts that are happening in our brains, in our bodies, in our spirits, that is then impacting mental health. This is all things we can start to sort of quantify and see. Of course, you know, every increase in the rank of subjective social status, your increase for substance abuse decreases. Isn't that amazing? Right? If you feel like you're climbing social status-wise, you're less likely to fall into addiction. You don't have a need to escape because things are being given to you already in this world. This is really important. Very quickly, I know that's a lot of funky data, but how does this relate to how you may individually go about your life? And one of the great ways to understand this is called the psychology of working theory. It's by Bluestein. It's a very good theory. And he basically says your mental health outcomes and how are deeply related to your work lives and how you conceptualize your work lives, your access to meaningful, dignified work that gives you your needs and gives you the appropriate amount of social status. And that is frequently restricted by things like, you know, systemic racism, economic inequality, marginalization. They all play a role in that, right? And all that plays a role into whether one has access to decent work. So if you work in the service industry, if you're working class, right, like my family was, you're more likely to work in areas and in jobs that do not supply you with dignity and safety and some of that attendant social status, right? If you do, then your chances are, if you do have all that, chances are you're gonna have better mental health outcomes. It's that simple, quote unquote, right? But it's complicated when you break it down. And so work supplies all those needs. And dignified, appropriate labor is the pathway to kind of building people back up again, or moving them from depths of despair. And as we've seen in the Muslim American community, this is not someone else's problem, this is our problem. 1 out of 3 of us are close to poverty. We have a high amount of inequality in our community. So Muslim Americans need access to dignified labor as a pathway to what we call social mobility and removing some of the class-based issues. Very quickly, I only have a minute left. Here are some action steps. I don't like to just give you bad news. Here are things we can do. There are a lot of social capital organizations, right? Like religious organizations, and of course unions, masjids that can buffer against the psychological and social impacts of economic distress, right? One of the great contributors to poor mental health is debt. So we as Muslim Americans who are working clinically should partner with relieving debt relief. It's a major part of our religion as well. We should learn and discuss classism and make it as an important contributor to poor mental health outcomes. Discuss classism in our community. And probably the most important thing you can do is mental health practitioners can take concrete steps to support labor unionization in our field and in others. Labor unions are the most evidence-based ways to reduce income inequality because they tilt the conflict of resources back towards where most people are, which is involved in a labor relationship as employees. The reduction of labor unions has been implicated in growing income inequality around the world, especially within America as we enter deindustrialization. If I could take you back to Case and Deaton's study, it found deaths of despair are directly linked to places that were deindustrialized the quickest. So they lost labor unions, which gave working class people the ability to create dignified, meaningful work of all backgrounds, and the loss of those, and we can kind of get into that, but it's a different presentation, but the loss of those is a huge impact on health and mental health. And then deaths of despair, which we see in our schools, which we see in our hospitals, we see in our clinics, we see in our personal lives, and we see in our community. And lastly, you should advocate for higher minimum wages. We have some good studies in densities, and looking at the density of certain areas. States and municipalities that were able to raise minimum wage laws saw an average decrease of suicide in that area. They're directly linked. Folks at the bottom of the social gradient are more likely to kill themselves. So increasing the minimum wages directly prevents them from killing themselves. This is something that should be part of our social justice avenue. So I'm going to end right there. Remember, this is a huge part of our religion and Islamic tradition to advocate for these things and put them all together, inshallah. That's it. Thank you.
Can we have another hand for Mr. Ali, please?
Thank you so much, Mr. Waleed Sami. So now we have another participant. Her name is Lina Suad. She is a 6th-year graduate student studying social psychology at Rutgers University, New Brunswick. Lina's graduate work examined the structure of stereotypes of Muslims in America, memory biases regarding Muslims motivated by perceptions of conflict, and ideological motivations for prejudice among dominant group members. So please give a big round of applause to Ms. Lina Suad.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. I just want to see, is volume good?
Yep, it's good. Are you going to screen share or do you want us to show?
I will. Yep. Let me get that set up.
You're all good then.
So it says I'm disabled for screen sharing. Could I be a co-host, perhaps?
I'm so sorry.
No problem. There we go. Yep. This is always how I have to start. Lots of Zoom presentations lately. Perfect. All right. Inshallah, let me press here. I wanted to start by saying I'm so honored that I was put on this panel with such excellent scholars. It's so exciting to see, fellow Muslims doing such excellent work. I think Alizah and Waleed, I will say, seeing your work as more like clinical psychologists or community psychologists was really interesting, much more applied. And I'll just say that as a social psychologist, everyone in the audience might notice that my work is far more academic focused, and it has less of the practical applications with, either clients that one works with or so forth. So I just wanted to point out just a baseline difference there, but nevertheless, we had a lot of constructs in common. So I'll be referring back to both of your talks here. I'll go ahead and get started. So I'm presenting here the project that I defended for my dissertation this past semester. It's called Differentiating Advantaged and Disadvantaged Groups' Responses to In-Group Transgressions. It's called a cross-status collective guilt model that I tested. Let me begin here. So groups are interesting and groups are complicated. There are members of groups who are contributing to culture and society as artists, comedians, politicians, activists. And there's also members of each group that are actually engaged in the destruction of societies. So we know that there are, at the bottom of the screen, people who've committed attacks on innocent civilians in the US, for example. And I have laid before you two groups in the US, white Americans, who are the more dominant advantaged groups in this country, the majority group, and Muslims are an example of a minority group here. And what's interesting in the kind of coverage, discussions, conversations in the community about different groups, oftentimes certain individuals remain in the imagination as kind of the exemplars of the group, depending on how the group is spoken about. And that could be the positive group members for an advantaged group, for example. And for a more disadvantaged group, a minority group like Muslims, we find that oftentimes it's the more, the less positive examples who end up becoming the exemplars of our group that people are looking to and thinking of when they imagine Muslims in their mind. I think someone's trying to enter the room. I'm going to leave that. So the question in this project is, how is it that an individual who sees that there is a person committing some type of transgression, some type of negative act that's now kind of being pinned on their group, does the reaction depend on their social status? So if we look at an advantaged group like whites versus a disadvantaged group like Muslims, does the social status have a qualitative and important difference in determining emotional reactions? And I will say, kind of bringing back to Waleed's talk that he just gave, the subjective perceptions of people is very important in the kind of baseline theorizing here. Because the way people perceive their group is everything in determining how they emotionally react to instances that could produce collective guilt. Now, collective guilt is broadly defined as an aversive emotional reaction to seeing a group member or group members doing something wrong and then being blamed for it by the society. Groups that are more advantaged tend to respond to these transgressions differently depending on their level of group identification. And I know Alizah referred to this kind of identity in the beginning. So essentially how much you're attached to your group. And it's not necessarily racial, but in this case, we can say high identifiers, people who are attached to their advantaged group tend to try to exonerate their group and say that didn't do anything wrong. People who are less identified with the advantaged group tend to kind of blame the group and experience collective guilt and then try to repair the harm. But not much work has looked at how disadvantaged groups react to this kind of collective global sense of blame. And so that's the key question that I was addressing in this project. How do disadvantaged group members respond to national or global in-group transgressions for which they are collectively blamed? And I'll just define like the type of transgressions that I focused on in this research were those committed by in-group members and not oneself, which affect out-group members, so people who are not part of a group, on a very large scale, either nationally or internationally. So a lot of social psychologists have looked at a historical instance of genocide, for example, or slavery, exploitation that the in-group is responsible for. Also in this project, I look at terrorism, for which Muslims are often held accountable for. And some key differences between advantaged and disadvantaged groups are important to point out. I think Waleed introduced a little bit of this kind of importance of subjective perception of how well one is doing as important. And so I'll just add to that. Often who's advantaged in a society is actually unambiguous. So there is this ladder of who's really doing well and who's not, but who's doing really well is typically in most societies pretty clear. they tend to be represented in politics, represented in media, doing well off in terms of, financial well-being. It's often justified who is doing the best in a society through things like kind of system justification. You justify the system in various ways. And advantage group members appreciate this individuation. Individuation is when the diversity of the group is appreciated. People know that members of the majority group in their society are different. There are the artists, and there are the politicians, there are the nerds, and there are those who are less interested in reading. People are different, and people know that because they encounter the majority group members all the time in the grocery store, in movies, and so forth. On the other hand, disadvantaged groups, minorities mostly, tend to be stereotyped because no one needs to, can, or wants to be detailed and accurate about them. And that sounds harsh, but essentially it's the fewer interactions with these group members, the fact that these group members are not really represented in positions of power, results in members of this group kind of being shrugged off. They tend to also be tokenized and treated as a monolith because of these realities. And so how will this factor in then to how collective guilt works? And in particular, how groups like Muslims might respond to instances of blame for terrorism as opposed to, for example, white Americans. So advantaged groups, I already said, the way they identify with their group really matters here. If you really are attached to your group, you're going to defend your group from blame because you can. You know that people think of your group as very complex and interesting. And so if one person from the group does something wrong, it doesn't mean that everyone's bad. And so advantaged group members know that, and they take advantage of that if they want to defend their group. If they don't care to defend their group because they're not really identifying with their group, they have that psychological distance to point the finger and say, we did something wrong here, and try to fix it. And there are many examples in the US of, advantaged group members, for example, whites who try to engage in reparative actions, who, stood with Black Americans in the Black Lives Matter movement, for example. Not to get into the details of that, but just an example of a low identifying person's response to collective blame. Now, for Muslims or minorities in general, I suspected that other factors could be influencing group behavior. And I'll kind of delve in here for a second. So imagine you're part of a group like Black Americans, for example, who are repeatedly seeing examples of how your group is treated as less human, for example, that lives are worth less than others because there are these instances of violence against the group repeatedly. Now that could have two different psychological consequences. Now the first is, you notice, for example, Dawson, a political scientist, pointed out that Black Americans in the US, African Americans in the US, for decades have voted on the same party lines, voted Democrat. Even when African Americans would reach higher SES and be, it would serve their pocketbooks to vote for Republicans, they still voted for Democrats because it was a vote for the group. And he attributed this to the sense of linked fate that African Americans have because of the repeated and long history of being treated in a way that's so deeply affects their livelihoods. The group ends up seeing their own life chances, or group members see their own life chances as depending heavily on the status and fortunes of the group. And it has this aura of wanting to uplift the group and help the group and focus one's energy on helping the group because one's aware that the group is treated a negative way, but we can positively influence how we respond to this. So it has more of a positive approach versus there's also this kind of awareness of disadvantage that can predominate. And I think Alizah referred to this in her talk. I think when you talked about the knowledge of systemic racism, that's exactly what I'm referring to here. It's this awareness that the group is treated differently in a negative way. And it results in kind of pointing the finger at whoever is in charge of the system, whoever's perpetuating the system, and saying, it's your fault that all of this is happening to my group. And so it has a more accusatory response to whoever might be dominant or advantaged in the society. And so the theory here goes is that, I do a lot of walking through the theory here, but I promise it'll, I want to walk through every step because this is really a new theory in the literature. So if a group member commits a transgression and it's actually a minority or disadvantaged group member. And so the transgression is being pinned on this disadvantaged group. Now, what might happen? If you are a member of the minority group, you see that members of your society are now pointing the finger and saying, you guys did something wrong. So for example, Muslims who see there was an attack by a member of ISIS yet again, and now everyone's looking at us saying we need to address this problem. If this group member is focusing on this instance through the primary lens of linked fate and wanting to uplift the group, they might respond by acquiescing to the blame and thinking, okay, our group is being blamed again. We need to come out of this. So let me just acquiesce to this blame. I will feel guilt and try to repair the harm done here so that we can come out of this better. And you guys could probably think of examples of Muslims that you know or yourself who respond in this way typically. On the other hand, if awareness of disadvantage, kind of knowledge of systemic racism is the primary lens to which you're viewing this instance of blame, then you may be less willing to acquiesce to blame and instead point the finger at the advantaged group to say, you continue to blame us even though we have nothing to do with this group member who did X or Y transgression. And thus you won't feel guilty or want to repair. And everyone in the audience might also be able to imagine or think of a Muslim in their lives or themselves who might feel these ways when another attack is being pinned on the Muslim American community. And so this is the model that this project proposed, looking at how group identification might really matter for advantaged groups in determining how group blame is responded to versus how linked fate and awareness of disadvantage will really matter for disadvantaged groups. And just to hone it in, being more identified with your group as an advantaged group member will result in being less willing to accept blame. For when you have a lot of linked fate as a disadvantaged group member, you might be willing to acquiesce and take the blame more. If kind of this knowledge of structural racism or prejudice is what's driving your thoughts as a disadvantaged group member, you might yield to blame less and not be willing to accept the blame. When you acquiesce to blame, you'll experience collective guilt, that emotional reaction then, and then you'll want to repair that negative emotional, to kind of appease yourself, if I may, assuage that guilt, you want to engage in some type of reparative action. So I'm testing this model, and I've hinted at this many times. I'm comparing how white Americans versus Muslim Americans respond to extremist violence. There are numerous examples of both whites and Muslims who have committed acts of extremism or terrorism against Americans in the US, unfortunately. But what's interesting is the instances are not treated the same. The media hyperbolizes threat from violent Muslims. So if you look at news articles are 3.5 times more likely to describe Muslims being violent than whites being violent. And this is all even though instances of extremist attacks in the US made by Muslims or whites since 2002 are generally equal. Politicians engage the narrative of violent Muslims. There was, for example, the hearing that Representative Peter King held. It was called kind of stemming the radicalization of Muslims in America. You know, we have many examples of how politicians engage this narrative, the least with Donald Trump. Negative public sentiment has kind of flowed from all of this. The Muslims are the religious group toward whom Americans feel the coldest feelings, even colder than toward atheists, which was shocking. And it's interesting, and it's likely it's due to these factors. So it's understandable in a sense. And what comes from all of this is that when there are instances of these attacks that happen, for example, the shooting in El Paso, Texas, versus the shooting at the nightclub in Orlando, and I pictured the perpetrators here, there's different attributions given. When there's an advantaged group member, a white person who's committed these attacks, news articles are 3 times more likely to describe mental health as an issue that kind of had something to do with what happened here, versus when it's a Muslim, terrorism is mentioned 3.5 times more often to kind of explain what the motivation was here. So clear differences in how these things are covered. And we as group members, either Muslim or white Americans, will respond differently depending on this. Perception matters, as Waleed had talked about just before my talk. So how did I test this hypothesis and look at this? I collected data from 1,000 Muslim Americans in a snowball sample. So sent out my survey to Muslims at mosques in New Jersey. I'm a New Jersey Rutgers student. So 3 masjids in New Jersey, and then people sent it out to their friends and their connections, and it just kind of gave us a nice large sample. And I collected data from 913 white American MTurk workers to compare. And there's some qualitative differences between the samples. Besides being Muslim and white, Muslims were far more likely to vote for, or significantly more likely to vote for Joe Biden in the last election. Muslims were more religious in terms of just reported religiosity, wearing likelihood to wear religious dress, likelihood to go to religious services than whites, which makes sense because we collected data from a religious group. Muslims reported significantly higher SES. The white sample reported significantly more conservative values than the Muslim sample and a significantly higher level of education. And so participants provided consent, and I'll kind of fly through these measures. They're not particularly important and for the sake of time, but participants completed my survey. They reported their level of identification with their group, either white or Muslim, the level of linked fate they feel with their group, their awareness of disadvantage that either Muslims or whites go through. So I'll mention just so you guys are aware. For example, the key idea among Muslims, like we're being treated as an enemy within, as evil, as dangerous. As for whites, it's focused far more on whites being seen as racist and backwards and so forth. And all participants then read a blurb that kind of describes the transgression, about how there are these in-group extremists who are really hurting Americans, and we really need to address this problem. So I really want to highlight for everybody that this is a problem so that I can have the best chance of kind of seeing what reactions are to blame. I'll keep this up here for just a moment, but I will not go through reading this because I do want to keep track of time. Participants reported their acquiescence to group blame, their level of collective guilt, and their desire to repair the harm that was done. And I'll talk about this specific measure more at the end. Then participants were debriefed, we compensated them. And so just made simple differences. Muslims outscored whites on all of the measures except reparative action intentions. Whites were significantly more likely to engage in the reparative actions that I had mentioned, and I'll talk about this more in my discussion here. Muslims were significantly more likely to acquiesce to blame and kind of accept the blame for in-group extremists, which is a hint at how Muslims are actually probably more routinely used to this situation of being blamed and needing to respond to blame for the in-group members' actions. Now, I have some really nitty-gritty results that I'm going to just focus on the key results that I found here. So I essentially ran a model to see if there were these differences that I suspected between the advantaged white group and the disadvantaged Muslim group. And so what I end up finding is that where in-group identification was supposed to matter more for whites, I did find some evidence for that. So where Muslims and whites both are more likely to acquiesce to blame, the more they are identified with their group, it was more important for whites. But what's interesting here is I suspected actually the opposite effect. Whites were supposed to be less likely to acquiesce to blame the more identified they were with the group. So I'll talk about this more towards the end. For linked fate, there was no actually difference in terms of how whites or Muslims responded depending on linked fate. Counter to my theory, because there's been so much research on how linked fate matters more for minorities than for whites. I'll talk more about that in a second. And then when we look at awareness of disadvantage as the moderator, we find that counter to predictions, the more aware of disadvantage for either Muslims or whites, the more aware, the more knowledgeable they are of kind of racism towards the group or prejudice towards the group, the more likely they were to acquiesce to blame. I had suspected that for Muslims in particular, there would be this like finger pointing to the general public saying, you guys are all being prejudiced towards us and we're not going to accept this. And that there would be a kind of negative effect here.
Lina, can you wrap it up with this slide? Is that okay?
Yep, this is the last, yeah, I'm on the discussion now. So I'll just say findings were counter then to what I had suspected. And I will say just as a final point, my suspicion is that either Muslims and whites, or whites see themselves more as disadvantaged than we might appreciate, or at least I might have appreciated in this study. But also on the other hand, in this study, people were in this survey and responding to this survey in a very micro level situation. But if we looked at a more real world example of whites and Muslims being blamed, we might find that Muslims will respond in the ways I theorized more than whites, because in the general kind of real world situation, it is the Muslim group that's being blamed more readily than whites for these acts of extremism. And that's the kind of the key take home from this project. And I'm looking forward to hearing your guys' comments and any ideas you might have. This is ongoing work. So thank you all so much. I can't hear. I think you're muted. So sorry.
Good.
Sorry about that. I'll repeat myself for the virtual audience. Thank you to our presenters. The presenters who were in person, if you could have a seat on the stage to address questions that come. If you are in the audience and you have questions, there should be note cards. There are note cards, so if you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand and one will be brought to you. But also, if you are in the chat, if you're with us virtually, you can absolutely post your questions in the chat and we will address them. We want to first ask, are there questions from the audience or the chat? Was there any? Okay, all right. So I want to thank our presenters. I'll go ahead and ask some questions that came up for me. I want to start with our last presenter. Your findings were interesting. I wonder, could you, because we kind of rushed it at the end for the sake of time, go through your the graphs where you talked about the last set of findings, those things that were surprising to you. I missed it. Were you saying that contrary to what you hypothesized, white individuals acquiesced more than what you predicted? I wondered if you could highlight just really briefly for us what those key findings were so that it's clear, and if anyone has questions about that, they can ask.
Yeah, so, and sorry, I can speak, right? This is, okay,
yes.
Perfect. Yeah, so essentially whites and Muslims responded far more similarly than we suspected, than I had just hypothesized, right? So there was just a lot of acquiescing to blame that was not predicted. And I can go into more detail if needed, but I will say my thinking is that perhaps in a survey study where everyone's being blamed the same way, whites might respond similarly because they're in the same situation as the Muslims. But if we look at, for example, Twitter conversations surrounding attacks that happen, we might find the qualitative differences that I talked about, because whites are actually less routinely blamed than Muslims for these acts. And I think we can, that's kind of anecdotal, but there is data to show that. And I kind of described that in my introduction to the study.
Yes, you did. And then I had another question for you that I think would clarify some things. When did you collect your data?
Great question. It was all spring 2020. So if everyone remembers, it was we were in the middle of the pandemic. For Muslims, things weren't particularly different besides the pandemic, but for whites, there was the insurrection at the US Capitol that had taken place on January 6th, 2020. So for whites, perhaps like white supremacy and white extremism maybe was just more readily seen for them, and that could have impacted how things looked in my study.
Okay, thank you. And then I have a question for across all the presenters. I know we talked on racial justice, we talked about income-inequality and poverty, and we also talked about, I'm trying to remember the grouping for yours, but the experiences of advantaged and disadvantaged groups. I'm curious, because you all touched on it a bit in your presentations, the ways in which what you examined, whether it was through the literature or your actual studies, the ways in which you saw the experiences, how those experiences may have differed within the group. We are a diverse community, right? And so when we think about different types of oppression that exists, whether it be racism, poverty, or religious discrimination, right? These things don't happen in a vacuum. And I start to hear you all talk about the other ways in which other forms of discrimination or oppression might shape sort of the outcomes. And I'm curious to know your thoughts, whether it's what you found or what you think you'll go do next, about the ways in which oppressions intersect to shape experiences for Muslims, whether it be your focus being on poverty, your focus being on racial justice, your focus being on religious identity. How do you think intersectionality plays a role in your research and the things that you've studied? Just your thoughts on that. Oh, yeah, sorry. If you would like to go, you can take a moment if there's a leader who would like to address that. I don't want to put anybody on the spot. Anybody wants to address that first?
Oh,
I could,
Oh, okay, we've got a speaker here who, was a lead.
I would like to hear what the other speakers have to say as well. But the question correctly was about the intersections of the various oppressions. Discussing my focus was on poverty and due to the historical nature of say racism in this nation. You're going to see poverty and inequality concentrated historically amongst first arriving immigrants and Black Americans, people of color properties. So one issue is when we look at income inequality and poverty, within America specifically, we have to see the kind of intersection of how race is classed, for lack of a better word. Right? There's a class association with which and I think that plays a very large role in the social gradient and the social determinants of health that then manifests in certain communities. So it's not necessarily if racial justice or economic justice, what is more important or salient. If you have greater racial justice, you have greater economic justice. You can't have it. Furthermore, if you make greater economic justice a priority in society, it will naturally decrease some of the structural damage done to racialized communities, especially Black communities, right, which have historical segregation and the limitation of the resources they're allowed to access. If you look at the social gradient, those who are concentrated at the bottom of the social gradient, as I mentioned, are folks of color, Black Americans, but also within those structurally challenging jobs, those service jobs, folks who have been exposed to unionization. There's a strong racial component, so not only a racial component. Like our third presenter mentioned, there are a lot of white Americans who have seen some of that status fall from debts of despair, unionization, to white America, all that poverty has been made explicitly clear. So there's room for political intersection there that advances and centers the role of basic material benefits. And I think we can have that conversation. We can have that conversation as it relates to say mental health and health impact. That's where I like to start the conversation, and you can kind of center that as a social justice problem. Those are just my two thoughts.
No problem. For that, and I asked that, and we do have a question for Dr. Lina. But I asked that because I know as someone who uses intersectionality in my research, even when we talk about, if you talk about oppression, I think that's what fits oppression more broadly. You're looking at that very, very narrow, right? So if we talk about income only, right? We can give people more money, but that does not erase the racism that exists, right? We can talk and grab racism, but that doesn't necessarily characterize sexism that exists. So if we don't challenge these systems altogether, right? Especially when we think about the Muslim community and the various forms of repression that people face, and don't account also for our privilege, then we're really not allowing ourselves to fully see full equality for all. There's one last question that came from the audience. Dr. Lina, did you account for white passing amongst Muslims to bypass the collective guilt and linked fate? Is it linked fate?
Yep.
Yeah, okay, yes.
Yeah, that looks like great question. Something I wanted to examine, and I will say, as you guys imagine, like a lot of Arabs identify as white. I tried to separate things by having a white category, African American, right? I have to say European white. I should have said European white, but essentially what ended up happening with my data is a lot of Arabs, Persians, European white, Muslims all hit white. And so the data was more muddy than it would have allowed me to kind of examine this specific question, because passing is questionable among Arabs. Like I ran some research showing that more and more recently, it's less easy to pass as white for some Arabs. And so I couldn't answer that question, but I want to run a follow-up. I'm developing a follow-up survey that's going to end up having like a European white category, African American category. And to your point as well, that you were just saying, to study intersectionality is so important. So hopefully I'll be able to make more kind of input and insights on the intersectional nature of all of this.
Thank you. That's the last question we have time for. I'm looking at presenters. We give them a round of applause. I want to thank our attendees who are virtual, those who are here. Our next presentation will be immediately following our keynote speaker.